where, and we'll jump to the definition of tidy data given in Hadley Wickham's book here, which are that each variable must have its own column, each observation must have its own row, and each value must have its own cell, right? And so we jump back to our little example here. We can see that that is the case in which each of our columns are variables of an observation of a reception. Each of the rows here represents an observation, and each of the cells have a value there.
Now that we have defined tidy data, let's get into the more practical part of this talk and how to apply what we've just learned. This little example with made-up reception data also shows how easy it is to record data in a tidy format. We're just filling in columns of values for characteristics of what we're trying to keep track of. But really, I want to highlight the advantages of collecting data in this format from the get-go, as compared to using a sheet like this one. If we look at this sheet makes it more difficult to collect rich data, actually. The metrics here are predefined, right? You see spaces for kills, in-play swings, errors, blocked, and so on and so forth. But what if I wanted to know if a kill was in first ball or in transition? Well, with this sheet, it's not impossible. I could get creative, maybe using different colors for marking, but tallying those different colors would become pretty labor intensive and certainly more prone to human error. Collecting data in a tidy format allows me to provide as much context for each contact as I want or am capable of recording. To illustrate that point, let's take a look at another set of made-up data, this time with attacking. Again, entering the data this way is pretty straightforward, and as you can see, there are more than enough columns to let me characterize each observation, in this case, an attack attempt, as I see fit. I want to highlight another powerful advantage of recording data straight into a spreadsheet editor, such as Excel, which is taking advantage of computational power. There's a fine line between lazy and efficient, and we might as well let a computer do all the computing for you. So here, again, I have some made-up data, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new column based on the results column. So I'm going to call it value, and I'm going to create a formula and say if the results column has the value of kill, then I want the value to be 1. Otherwise, I'm going to start another if formula, and I'm going to say if it's not a kill, then if this cell is an error, then I want to make this value -1, and if it's neither of those, then it'll just be 0. And for right now, that would just mean in play. All right, I let it correct, and now I can copy and paste this formula, and now I have a corresponding value to the results column here, right? So kills are worth 1, in play attacks are worth 0, and errors are worth -1. And if I continue to keep recording data as so, I'm going to just make this up. A neat thing that happens in Excel is this formula, since it's consistent all the way down this column, will continue to automatically fill. Right? And so if I add another one, let's say Alon hits a red and it's in play. And you can see how the value column, because it's a consistent formula, will continually automatically update here. So again, we're using the computational power of Excel or spreadsheet editor to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. Now that we have some tidy data collected, how do we use it? Well, we have some options. we could either build our own tables and formulas from scratch, as I had for about the 8+ years I've been working with volleyball data in Excel, or we can learn how to use a pivot table. And to be completely honest, the first time I used a pivot table in Excel was about 2 weeks ago, specifically for the purpose of this talk. And I now realize how many hours of repetitive work this could have saved me over all those years. But anyways, let's continue with this sample attacking data. So I'm going to come in here in this top option bar in the Insert tab and insert a pivot table. You can see this menu pops up, Create Pivot Table. You can see my data is now highlighted in the range. And I'm just going to click OK. It's going to create a new worksheet. And so in this new worksheet, I have this template for a pivot table. And on the right-hand side here, I have a pivot table field list. And it automatically has picked up my column names or variable names. And I have these 4 little sub-windows here, or areas, that I can drag these variables into. All right, so we have report filter, row labels, column labels, and values. So as I build this table, I'm going to use player names as my row labels. And you can see as I drag this variable into the row label area, now I have a new table that pops up on the left-hand side. I'll zoom in a little bit here. And you can see here are all the names of the attackers that I have listed in my data from my raw data sheet. Now I want to count up the number of attempts that each player has in this raw data sheet. And so I'm going to grab this value variable and I'm going to drop it into this values area here. You can see when I've dropped the value variable into the sub area, the label changed from values to sum of value, and the sum of the value is not what I want here, and so I'm going to click on that and click on value field settings, and instead of the sum of the values, I just want the count of the values. So how many values for each player are in the data. And so I'm going to choose count here, and I'm going to give it a custom name of ATT for attempts. And I hit OK, and now you can see instead of the sum of the values for each player, I have now a count of essentially the observations for each player, right? Or from a volleyball standpoint, the number of attempts that each player has from the data that we've collected. Similarly, I'd like to add information about each attacker's attack efficiency. And so using the value variable again, I'm going to drop another copy of that into the values sub area. And again, I don't want the sum of this value, and so I'm going to click in value field settings, and this time instead of count, I'm going to take the average of the values. And instead of this custom name, I'm going to call this EFF for efficiency. And when I hit OK, now I can see I've got attack efficiencies for each player summed up across their data from the raw data sheet. Now, maybe these numbers are not formatted necessarily the way I'd like, and so I'm going to click back in here in my efficiency tab. I'm going to click on number format, select number, and use a little more standard 3 decimal places. Hit OK, and that looks a lot cleaner now. Now here's where the power of the pivot table really comes into play. Because we have our data organized in a tidy format with multiple variables describing the characteristics of each attack, we can now use those variables to filter our data in meaningful ways to get a better understanding of what our data is trying to tell us. Before we do that, let's take a look at Noah's attack line. 4 attempts with 0 efficiency. Based on those points alone, it would be quite easy to jump to the conclusion that his attacking performance here is quite poor. But is there more to the story than that? Let's add information about the attack type to our table by dropping the attack type variable down into our row labels below the player row label. And when I do that, now I can see a breakdown of each of the attack types that each player has performed. And if we go down and look at Noah's attacks, you can see that of his 4 attacks, he had 2 goes, so we'll call that his in-system attacks, and 2 huts, his out-of-system attacks. And in his 2 goes, he looks like he had 1 kill and 1 in-play swing for an efficiency of 500. And his huts, it looks like he had 1 error and 1 in-play swing for negative 500 efficiency. And so because we're able to break this information down by attack type, now we get a little bit clearer story of what's going on. So it's not that necessarily that Noah's having a poor attacking match overall, but it looks like in system, he's having a good time, but out of system, he's struggling a little bit. To further illustrate the features of the pivot table, we can also move the attack type variable from the row labels area into the report filter area to narrow the scope of our comparisons. This would come in handy if we want to narrow our focus for comparison. For example, let's compare our attacker's metrics, but only for the attack type Go. So let's take off all these other swings, select just Go, and hit OK. And so now you can see this top little area acts as our filter. And when we use this filter, our table narrows down to just the scope of the data that we filtered for. So only Jacob, Noah, and Owen had hit some goes. You can see how many goes they hit and what their efficiency was in each of those.